For nearly a century, the machine that stood on more American kitchen counters than almost any other object in the house wasn't a stove or a refrigerator. It was a stand mixer with a name that promised warmth: Sunbeam. Three generations of American women learned to bake standing in front of the same humming motor, the same two beaters turning in perfect rhythm. By the late 1970s, Sunbeam was the largest small appliance maker on Earth, a company built on the promise that American-made things were built to last a lifetime, passed from mother to daughter like a piece of furniture. 20 years later, that same company would collapse into bankruptcy, its finances a fabrication, its most trusted name attached to a scandal studied in business schools as a warning. How does a company that built its entire identity on trust become one of the most notorious accounting frauds in American corporate history? The answer starts not in a boardroom, but in a small workshop in Chicago in 1897, with two men who had never intended to build kitchens at all. Chicago Flexible Shaft Company began in 1897 with no interest in kitchens at all. John K. Stewart and Thomas J. Clark set up shop on the city's west side, making sheep shears and horse clippers, the unglamorous machinery of American farms and stables. For over a decade, the business ran on that simple mechanical logic: motors that cut, motors that trimmed, motors built to survive hard, repetitive labor. Nobody walking past the factory floor in those early years would have guessed that this company would end up defining the American kitchen. The shift came quietly. In 1910, the company introduced its first appliance meant for the home rather than the barn: the Princess, an electric iron. It was a small pivot, almost an afterthought against the company's core business. But it revealed something the founders may not have fully understood yet: that the same precision motors used to shear a sheep could be turned toward an entirely different customer: the American housewife standing at an ironing board, tired of heating iron on a stove. By 1920, the company had gone further, releasing its first product to carry a new name, one meant to evoke warmth and everyday reliability. They called it Sunbeam. The person who would turn that name into a national institution hadn't even arrived in the country yet. In 1929, a 24-year-old immigrant from Sweden walked into the company's offices on Roosevelt Road. His name was Ivar Jepsen, a draftsman with formal training and an eye for form that few of his older, more established colleagues possessed. Jepsen had grown up in a country with a deep design tradition, one that treated everyday objects, chairs, tools, lamps, as things worth making beautiful, not just functional. He brought that instinct into a Chicago factory still thinking of itself as a maker of farm equipment. Jepsen's core belief was simple, almost stubborn in its clarity. A machine a family would keep in their kitchen for 20 years had to feel as good as it worked. It could not look like an industrial tool bolted onto a countertop. It had to look like it belonged in someone's home. Working alongside company president Michael McArdle, who had already built a reputation for chasing new patents out of the Chicago Flexible Shaft Research Labs, Jepsen began designing what would become the company's signature achievement: a stand mixer unlike anything else on the market, with two detachable beaters that interlocked as they spun. The first customers who bought into this vision were not wealthy families chasing the latest gadget. They were working households across the Midwest, women who baked out of necessity as much as tradition, who saw in this new machine not a luxury, but a promise that an hour of exhausting hand mixing could become 5 minutes of quiet, mechanical ease. They did not know they were buying into the beginning of a company that would eventually employ tens of thousands of people and sit in nearly every American kitchen. They only knew the machine worked, and worked well, week after week. By the time Jepsen's mixer was ready for its public debut, the company had already quietly built the foundation of something much larger than anyone at Chicago Flexible Shaft had originally imagined. What came next would turn a single well-designed appliance into the defining symbol of an entire era of American home life. In 1930, Sunbeam introduced the machine Ivar Jepsen had spent years perfecting: the Mixmaster. It was the first mechanical mixer with two detachable beaters that interlocked as they spun, a small mechanical detail that made an enormous difference in how evenly batter blended, how quickly a cake came together, how little a woman's arm ached afterward. Within a few years, it had become the standard against which every other kitchen mixer was measured. But the Mixmaster was only the beginning of a run of products that would define American domestic life for the next 4 decades. In 1938, Sunbeam released the Coffee Master, a striking glass and chrome device with a spherical design and a patented internal thermostat. A customer needed only to fill the lower chamber with water and the upper chamber with coffee, then walk away. The machine did the rest, brewing coffee automatically and holding it warm until someone was ready to pour a cup. At $16, it was not cheap, a significant purchase for most households in the late 1930s. Yet it became a national bestseller and stayed in production for 2 decades. A year later came the Iron Master, a streamlined iron with a thumb-operated heat dial built directly into the handle, advertised as the end of tired arms and uneven pressing. Each of these products carried the same quiet signature, a machine that did not simply work but felt considered, as if someone had thought carefully about the hands that would use it every single day. For the families who brought these appliances into their homes, the experience went beyond function. A new Sunbeam Mix Master arriving in a kitchen was an event. A woman might have saved for months or received it as a wedding gift. And the first time she plugged it in and heard that steady, confident hum, she was not just making a cake. She was stepping into a version of modern American life that her own mother might never have had access to. Neighbors noticed. A Sunbeam appliance sitting on a countertop was a quiet signal of a household that had arrived, that could afford ease, that took pride in its kitchen. Sunbeam ran magazine advertisements that leaned directly into this feeling, showing gleaming appliances in bright, orderly kitchens, promising not just a working tool, but a share in the American ideal of comfort and progress. Recipe booklets came packaged with new mix masters, teaching a generation of home bakers exactly how to use the machine's various attachments, a juice extractor, a meat grinder, a slicer shredder, turning one purchase into an entire kitchen ecosystem. Behind these products stood a design and engineering team in Chicago that took its work with unusual seriousness for an appliance company. Ivar Jepsen, joined in 1936 by designer George Scharfenberg, treated each new release as an opportunity to refine not just performance, but form. Chrome bodies, Bakelite handles, rounded corners that softened the machine's industrial edges. Employees on the Roosevelt Road factory floor understood that they were not simply assembling motors. They were building objects that would sit in a place of honor in someone's home for years, sometimes decades. That pride showed in the durability of what they made. Decades later, collectors and repair technicians would still find Sunbeam appliances from the 1930s and 1940s running as reliably as the day they left the factory, a testament to a manufacturing culture that prioritized longevity over planned obsolescence. By 1955, that culture and the sales it generated had carried Sunbeam to a striking milestone. Fortune magazine ranked it the 317th largest corporation in America, an extraordinary position for a company that, within living memory, had made its money-sharing sheep. Sunbeam had woven itself into the rhythms of American domestic life so thoroughly that it rarely needed to explain itself. A bride received a mix master as a wedding gift and understood, without being told, what it meant. A family gathered on a Sunday morning to the smell of coffee brewing on its own in a coffee master. A father, ironing his own shirt collar with steady, even strokes, trusted an iron master to do it right. These were not simply transactions. They were the small, repeated rituals through which a company earned something far more valuable than brand recognition, a place inside people's memories of home. What none of those families could have known, standing in their kitchens in the 1950s and 1960s, was how much a strain a corporation could withstand before something quietly began to give. Sunbeam's reputation for quality had been built over 60 years of careful, patient engineering. The question that would define its next chapter was whether that same patience could survive contact with a much faster, much less forgiving kind of American business. One measured not in the lifespan of an appliance, but in the lifespan of a fiscal quarter. By 1960, Sunbeam's leadership understood something important. A single great mixer, however beloved, was not enough to sustain a company competing in a rapidly expanding American consumer market. That year, Sunbeam acquired the John Oster Manufacturing Company, a Racine, Wisconsin firm that had built its own reputation in an entirely different arena: barbershops and beauty salons. Oster had spent decades making motors for clippers and massage equipment before turning, after World War II, to a countertop blender it called the Osterizer. The device had quietly become a household name in its own right, and folding it into Sunbeam's lineup gave the company something it had never fully possessed before. A second flagship product aimed at a slightly different customer, sold through many of the same stores. The logic behind this expansion was straightforward. A company that made irons, mixers, and coffee makers could reasonably extend into blenders, toasters, hair dryers, and eventually outdoor grills and lawn sprinklers. Each new category leaning on the same manufacturing expertise and the same trusted name. Growth did not come through franchising, as it might have for a restaurant chain, or through opening new storefronts, as it might have for a retailer. It came through acquisition and product line expansion, absorbing smaller specialist manufacturers and putting the Sunbeam or Oster name on their output. Throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, Sunbeam folded in companies like the Rain King Sprinkler Company, adding lawn and garden equipment to a catalog that had once been limited to the kitchen counter. This was growth measured in decades, not quarters, and it showed. What had been a single product line built around Ivor Jepson's original mixer had by the late 1970s become dozens of items across multiple categories: kitchen appliances, personal care devices, outdoor equipment, home comfort products like electric blankets and humidifiers. Each new line carried the company deeper into American households, until Sunbeam products were represented in nearly every room of the home, not just the kitchen. By the end of the 1970s, this expansion had built something remarkable: annual sales of roughly $1.3 billion and a workforce of nearly 30,000 people spread across factories in Chicago, Racine, and beyond. It was, by any measure, the largest and most recognized name in American small appliances. For the employees inside this expanding company, growth carried two faces at once. Joining Sunbeam in the 1960s or 1970s could mean genuine opportunity, steady work in an industry that seemed to expand every year, a chance to build a career inside a company whose products people trusted implicitly. A machinist in Racine or an assembly line worker in Chicago could reasonably expect the kind of stability that had once been the promise of American manufacturing at its best. A job that lasted, a paycheck that kept pace, a product line that kept growing. But that same growth also brought new pressures that hadn't existed when Sunbeam was a smaller, more tightly run operation. As the company absorbed new brands and expanded into new categories, it needed larger factories, tighter production schedules, and a management structure equipped to coordinate operations across an increasingly sprawling portfolio. The intimate, design-driven culture that had defined Sunbeam under Jepson's era, a small team obsessing over the curve of an iron's handle or the interlock of a beater, inevitably diluted as the company scaled into a true industrial giant. There was also a quieter risk embedded in this kind of growth, one that would not become visible for years. A company built through acquisition depends on the discipline of the people running it, on leadership that understands which categories genuinely fit the brand's identity and which merely add revenue without adding meaning. In its early decades of expansion, Sunbeam's leadership largely got this right, choosing acquisitions like Oster that complemented its existing strengths and reinforced, rather than diluted, what customers already trusted the name to deliver. The company's reputation for durability and quality survived the transition from single-product mixer maker to multi-category appliance conglomerate remarkably intact. But scale changes the calculus of who controls a company's future. A firm valued at over $1 billion in annual sales, with factories across several states and a name recognized in nearly every American home, was no longer simply a family business answering to its founder's original vision. It was now the kind of asset that attracted outside investors, corporate strategists, and eventually buyers with no particular attachment to sheep shears, Chicago workshops, or the quiet pride of a well-made iron. Sunbeam's success in building itself into an industry giant had also, without anyone fully realizing it at the time, built something else: a target. By the end of the 1970s, Sunbeam had reached a size that made it, by nearly every measure available, the largest small appliance manufacturer in the world. Annual sales of roughly $1.3 billion, close to 30,000 employees, and products sitting on countertops from coast to coast. But numbers alone never fully capture what a brand means to the people living alongside it. What made Sunbeam different from its competitors in this era was not simply its size. It was the sense that the name had become inseparable from the idea of a well-run American household. Television advertising in the 1960s and 1970s leaned hard into this identity, showing gleaming kitchens where a Sunbeam appliance sat at the center of family life. A mother pulling a golden cake from the oven after mixing the batter in a mixmaster, a father grilling on a Sunbeam barbecue while neighbors gathered in the backyard, a coffee pot brewing itself before anyone in the house had even woken up. These were not aspirational fantasies aimed at wealthy households. They were deliberately ordinary scenes, meant to reflect a middle-class American life that viewers already recognized as their own. Sunbeam did not need to convince people its products were exceptional. It needed only to remind them that these machines were already woven into the life they were living. For employees working inside Sunbeam factories during this peak period, there was genuine pride attached to the name on their paycheck. A worker assembling toasters in Chicago or blenders in Racine understood that the object leaving their hands that day would likely end up in someone's kitchen for the next 15 or 20 years. Not discarded after a season, not treated as disposable, but kept, used, and eventually handed down. Line workers took a certain ownership in that longevity. Quality control was not an abstract corporate policy. It was a practical recognition that a Sunbeam appliance carried the company's name into someone's home for decades, and that reputation depended on every single unit performing exactly as promised. Perhaps the clearest evidence of how deeply Sunbeam had embedded itself into American life was the way its products moved across generations within a single family. A woman who had received a Mixmaster as a wedding gift in the 1950s might still be using that same machine 20 years later, teaching her own daughter to bake with it. A father who trusted his Sunbeam iron to press a shirt collar correctly passed that same confidence on to a son setting up his first apartment. This was not simply brand loyalty in the way modern marketers use the term. It was closer to inheritance, a set of tools that moved through a family the way a good set of hand tools or a reliable car might, valued precisely because they did not need to be replaced. This reach extended across geography and income level in a way few consumer brands ever achieve. Sunbeam products were not positioned as luxury items for wealthy coastal households, nor were they marketed exclusively to a single region or demographic. They appeared with equal familiarity in a farmhouse kitchen in the Midwest, a suburban ranch home outside Atlanta, and a city apartment in Chicago itself, the very place the company had begun as a maker of sheep shears. Few American manufacturers of any era could claim that kind of genuinely national cross-class presence. A brand equally at home in a small-town hardware store display and a major department store's flagship kitchen department. What made a company achieve that kind of ubiquity, transforming a set of kitchen appliances into something closer to a shared cultural memory? Part of the answer lay in decades of consistent product quality that gave families no reason to look elsewhere. Part of it lay in advertising that reflected everyday American life back to itself rather than reaching for aspiration or novelty. And part of it was simply time. 60 years of steady, patient growth, each generation introducing the next to the same trusted name. Standing at this peak in the years just before 1980, few people inside or outside the company would have predicted what was coming. Sunbeam looked, by every visible measure, unshakable. An industry leader with a devoted customer base, a workforce proud of what it built, and a reputation 7 decades in the making. But size and trust, however deeply earned, do not automatically protect a company from the decisions of the people who come to control it. And in 1981, control of Sunbeam was about to change hands in a way that would begin to test everything the company had spent generations building. In 1981, Sunbeam's board agreed to sell the company to Allegheny International, a Pittsburgh-based conglomerate looking to add a recognizable consumer name to its portfolio of industrial holdings. For the families who had grown up trusting the Sunbeam name, nothing about this transaction was visible in their daily lives. The Mixmaster still sat on the counter. The Coffee Master still brewed itself each morning. From the outside, nothing had changed at all. But inside the company, the shift was immediate and severe. Most of Sunbeam's original Chicago area factories, The same buildings where Ivar Jepsen had once sketched the curves of the first Mixmaster closed their doors. Corporate headquarters moved out of the city that had given the company its name and its identity for 84 years, relocating instead into a 32-floor skyscraper in downtown Pittsburgh, a signature tower built to house Allegheny International's growing empire. For the workers left behind in Chicago, the message was unmistakable. The company that had once measured its success in decades of careful craftsmanship now answered to owners who measured it in quarterly performance from 600 miles away. Under Allegheny's ownership, at least on paper, Sunbeam did not decline. Through much of the 1980s, it remained the largest small appliance manufacturer in the world, its brand strength apparently undiminished by the change in ownership. Advertisements kept running, stores kept stocking the shelves, customers kept buying, unaware that behind the scenes, the parent company steering their trusted brand was quietly accumulating problems that had nothing to do with mixers, irons, or blenders. Those problems surfaced in 1986 when Allegheny International's shareholders accused Chairman and Chief Executive Robert Buckley of misappropriating company funds. It was the kind of accusation that rarely reaches the ears of ordinary customers, buried in financial pages and shareholder meetings, rather than television commercials. A woman in Ohio, replacing her mother's worn-out Mixmaster with a new one, had no reason to know that the executives now overseeing the company's fortunes were under scrutiny for how they had handled its money. Buckley's successor, Oliver Travers, moved quickly to downsize the sprawling conglomerate, shedding businesses that no longer fit in narrowing Allegheny's focus. By 1988, what remained of the empire had been stripped down to essentially two names, Sunbeam and Oster, the very appliance business that had once been the acquisition, not the core. Then came a blow that had nothing to do with Sunbeam's products or its management at all. In October 1987, the American stock market suffered its worst single-day crash since the Great Depression, wiping out value across nearly every publicly traded company in the country. For a corporation already weakened by internal financial troubles and a leadership scandal, the crash removed whatever cushion might have allowed a slower, more careful recovery. Allegheny International, the parent company that had absorbed Sunbeam 7 years earlier, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. How does a company built on 90 years of trust, still selling its products in nearly every American town, end up trapped inside a bankruptcy filing it had no direct hand in causing? The uncomfortable truth is that by 1989, Sunbeam's fate was no longer being decided by anyone who understood mixers or irons or the 80 years of engineering pride that had built the brand's reputation. It was being decided by bankruptcy courts, creditors, and investors, evaluating Sunbeam not as a beloved American institution, but as a financial asset to be salvaged, restructured, or sold. That sale came in the fall of 1989 when an investment group called Japonica Partners purchased the remains of Allegheny International for $250 million in a hostile takeover, a sum that would represent well over $600 million in today's money. The once independent Sunbeam Corporation, founded by two Chicago businessmen making sheep shears in 1897, now belonged to a group of financiers whose expertise lay not in manufacturing durable kitchen appliances, but in identifying undervalued companies and extracting value from them. The new owners renamed their holding Sunbeam Oster Company, Inc., a name that acknowledged the brand's history while signaling to anyone paying close attention that a new kind of ownership had arrived. One accustomed to moving quickly, cutting deeply, and answering first to returns rather than reputation. For most Sunbeam customers in 1989, none of this registered. The appliances kept working. The name on the box looked the same. But inside the company, a pattern had now repeated itself twice in less than a decade. An American manufacturing institution, built slowly over generations, passing into the hands of owners who saw it primarily as a balance sheet to be optimized. The quiet damage of the 1980s had not yet reached the kitchen counter. It would not stay contained there much longer. Under Japonica Partners, Sunbeam Oster spent the early 90s undergoing a slow, methodical rebuild. The new owners brought in professional management, expanded advertising, and pushed hard on the Made in America identity that had defined the brand for generations, running campaigns that leaned directly into nostalgia and national pride. Chairman Paul Kazarian oversaw notable turnaround gains, though his combative management style eventually alienated enough shareholders that they removed him in early 1993. Under his successor, the company continued posting record growth, expanding into international markets, until by 1996, its private equity owners judged the company ready for something bigger. A public stock offering, giving Japonica a chance to finally cash out on an investment made 7 years earlier. Being a public company changed the pressures on Sunbeam in a way that private ownership never had. Quarterly earnings reports now mattered enormously, scrutinized by analysts and shareholders expecting consistent growth. When sales and profits began lagging in 1996, the board went looking for someone who could deliver dramatic, visible results, fast. They found him in Albert Dunlap, a former West Point cadet who had built a national reputation in the 1980s and early 1990s as a turnaround specialist, willing to do what other executives wouldn't. At Scott Paper, Dunlap had slashed the workforce and sold the company at a substantial profit within roughly 18 months, a maneuver that made him wealthy and earned him a nickname that followed him into every subsequent job. Chainsaw Al. He had written a best-selling book about his methods called Mean Business, and Wall Street treated his arrival at any struggling company as an announcement that swift, aggressive change was coming. In July 1996, Sunbeam's largest investors, Michael Price and Michael Steinhardt, installed Dunlap as chairman and chief executive. The market's reaction was immediate. Sunbeam's stock price jumped by roughly 50% within weeks of his hiring, adding hundreds of millions of dollars in market value before Dunlap had made a single operational change. Within his first year, he moved aggressively on the strategy that had made his name. Factories closed, warehouses shut, thousands of employees terminated, and the company's product line slashed by more than 80%, eliminating anything that didn't fit his narrower, leaner vision of the business. Coopers and Lybrand consultants helped design a restructuring plan built around this philosophy, and roughly 250 of Sunbeam's top executives and managers received substantial stock options tied to a 3-year vesting schedule, a structure that gave them every incentive to stay quiet, endure Dunlap's famously abrasive management style, and help drive the stock price higher. For a while, it worked exactly as Dunlap had promised. Sunbeam reported record earnings of $189 million for 1997, and the company's stock climbed steadily through the following months, eventually reaching an all-time high of $52 a share in March 1998, following the announcement of 3 new acquisitions: outdoor equipment maker Coleman, smoke detector manufacturer First Alert, and Signature Brands, the company behind Mr. Coffee. On paper, Sunbeam looked like a genuine turnaround success story, exactly the kind of dramatic recovery that had made Dunlap wealthy and famous at every company he had touched before. But inside Sunbeam's finance department, a very different story was unfolding, one that would not become public for several more months. What Dunlap and his hand-picked financial officer, Russell Kirsch, understood was that a turnaround this dramatic could not be sustained through cost-cutting alone. So they turned to a set of accounting techniques designed to manufacture the appearance of growth rather than the substance of it. Kirsch began deliberately shifting costs incurred in 1997 into the previous year's books, making Dunlap's first year look artificially disastrous and his second year look artificially triumphant by comparison, a technique investigators would later describe as cookie jar accounting. Sunbeam also began offering retailers steep discounts to purchase products months before they were needed, along with the right to cancel those orders later, a practice known as channel stuffing, and recorded those sales as completed revenue the moment the deal was signed, rather than when the goods actually shipped, a variation of an accepted practice called bill and hold, twisted past its legal boundaries. Deep inside the company, one person noticed. Deidre Dendanto, a young internal auditor, spent much of 1997 and into 1998 flagging troubling patterns in product returns, questionable internal controls, and unusual bill and hold transactions. She raised her concerns repeatedly through the proper channels. Management was not responsive. Eventually, worn down by the resistance, she resigned in frustration. One of the few people inside Sunbeam who had seen the truth clearly and tried, without success, to stop it before it reached the public. What happens when the people paid to catch a company's mistakes are ignored by the very leadership benefiting from those mistakes? By early 1998, Sunbeam's stock sat near its historic peak. Its executives sat on stock options worth millions, and its reported turnaround was being held up across financial media as proof that Chainsaw Al's brutal methods, once again, had worked exactly as advertised. Almost none of it was true, and the machinery built to keep that fact hidden was already beginning to strain under its own weight. By the first quarter of 1998, the mechanics that had propped up Sunbeam's reported turnaround were running out of room. The company had already exhausted the restructuring reserves it could plausibly draw from 1996's books, and the newly acquired companies, Coleman, First Alert, and Signature Brands, were meant to provide fresh cover, new one-time charges that could be folded into ongoing operations to disguise the underlying weakness of the business. But even that maneuver couldn't close the gap. As the quarter neared its end, Sunbeam still hadn't hit the sales and profit numbers Wall Street expected. Rather than report the shortfall, the company quietly extended its own fiscal quarter by 2 extra days, pulling in additional sales to pad the results, and never disclosed that extension in its required filings with the Securities and Exchange Commission, a decision that misled every analyst and investor relying on those numbers to make honest judgments about the company's health. It was not enough. In April 1998, Sunbeam announced a first-quarter loss, and the stock that had stood at $52 a share barely a month earlier collapsed by 25% almost overnight. The dramatic turnaround investors had been promised had, in the space of a single earnings report, revealed itself as fragile. Industry analysts who had trusted the story now began asking harder questions. Andrew Shore, a stock analyst at Payne Weber, had already been quietly flagging something unusual in Sunbeam's public filings: inventory and accounts receivable numbers that were growing far faster than actual sales, a red flag suggesting the company was shipping products it hadn't truly sold. Even Sunbeam's own outside auditors at Arthur Andersen had, in at least one instance, noticed a questionable accounting technique in the company's books and dismissed it as immaterial, a judgment call that would later draw its own scrutiny. Inside Sunbeam's boardroom, the mood shifted from confidence to alarm within weeks. Directors who had spent nearly 2 years defending Dunlap's aggressive methods now found themselves demanding answers about accounting practices they didn't fully understand and increasingly didn't trust. On June 13, 1998, the Sunbeam board fired Albert Dunlap. Russell Kirsch, his financial officer and the architect of much of the questionable accounting, was dismissed shortly after. The executive team that had been rewarded with hundreds of stock options for staying loyal through Dunlap's brutal tenure now watched those same options become worthless as the company's stock kept falling. The board brought in a new chief executive, Jerry Levin, along with an entirely new management team, and the Securities and Exchange Commission opened a formal investigation into how Sunbeam had reported its finances during Dunlap's 2 years at the helm. What followed was a long, painstaking unraveling. It took outside auditors 4 months to work through the company's books from that period and confirm what insiders like Deidre Dendanto had already suspected. Many of the underlying accounting choices had been technically legal in isolation, but assembled together, they told a story about Sunbeam's health that bore little resemblance to reality. When the dust settled, the company was forced to restate its 1997 net income, cutting the previously reported $109 million nearly in half down to just $38 million. In December 1998, Sunbeam fired Arthur Andersen, the accounting firm that had signed off on its misleading financial statements, and replaced it with Deloitte and Touche. For the employees who had spent the previous 2 years absorbing layoffs, plant closures, and a management style built on fear rather than trust, the restatement confirmed something they may have quietly suspected all along. The numbers used to justify their sacrifice had never been entirely honest in the first place. For shareholders who had bought Sunbeam stock near its $52 peak, believing they were investing in one of the great American corporate turnarounds of the decade, the truth was far harder to accept. They had in effect been sold a story rather than a company. The new management team inherited a business that was smaller, weaker, and far more damaged than the fraudulent books had ever admitted. And despite genuine efforts to stabilize operations, it would prove unable to reverse the damage that 2 years of manufactured success had left behind. The public unraveling of Sunbeam did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened in stages, each one stripping away more of what the company's fraudulent accounting had spent 2 years disguising. The first real signal had already arrived in April 1998, when Sunbeam's stock collapsed 25% following the disclosure of a first quarter loss. But that was only the opening crack. Over the following months, as the Securities and Exchange Commission investigation deepened and the company worked through the painstaking process of restating 2 years of financial statements, the full scale of the damage came into view, not all at once, but in a slow accumulation of bad news that eroded whatever confidence remained among investors, retailers, and employees alike. By the time Jerry Levin and his new management team took over in mid-1998, they inherited a business fundamentally weaker than the one Wall Street had been celebrating just months earlier. The acquisitions Dunlap had rushed through in his final months as CEO, Coleman, First Alert, and Signature Brands, had added roughly $1.9 billion in goodwill to Sunbeam's books, a premium price paid for companies that were now expected to somehow rescue a business whose core numbers had been artificially inflated for 2 straight years. Rather than strengthening Sunbeam's position, this debt load became an anchor. The company's net worth, once estimated at roughly $500 million under Dunlap's celebrated turnaround, had by some measures actually turned negative once the fraudulent gains were stripped away and the acquisition debt was properly accounted for. Levin's team spent the following 2 years trying to stabilize a company now saddled with debt it could not comfortably service, a damaged reputation among investors, and a workforce that had already been cut to the bone under Dunlap's restructuring, leaving little room for further cost savings. Class action securities fraud lawsuits piled up from shareholders who felt they had been deliberately misled into buying stock at inflated prices. Sunbeam's own outside directors, the same ones who had cheered Dunlap's arrival and rewarded his executive team with stock options for staying loyal through the layoffs, now found themselves defending the company in litigation stemming from decisions made largely without their full understanding. For employees who remained at Sunbeam through this period, the experience was one of prolonged uncertainty rather than a single clean break. There was no dramatic announcement of a final closing day, no locked factory gates on a specific afternoon that made national news the way some corporate collapses do. Instead, there was a slow, grinding realization that the company they worked for was weaker than they'd been told, that the turnaround they had sacrificed jobs and colleagues to achieve had been substantially fabricated, and that the road ahead offered little more certainty than the one they had just survived. Some had already lost their positions in Dunlap's restructuring. Others watched stock options that once seemed like a path to real wealth become essentially worthless as the share price kept sliding towards single digits. Media coverage of Sunbeam's unraveling took on a different character than typical corporate bankruptcy stories. Business publications like Forbes, which had been skeptical of Dunlap's methods from the very beginning, treated his downfall almost as vindication, a confirmation that the celebrated ruthlessness that had made him wealthy at Scott Paper and other companies had finally caught up with him. The story took on an almost cautionary morality tale quality in the business press. A swaggering executive who had written a book called Mean Business, who had built a personal brand around fearless cost-cutting, brought down not by his harshness, but by his dishonesty. That distinction mattered enormously to how the story was told and remembered. Sunbeam's collapse was not simply another company failing to compete. It became one of the defining case studies of corporate fraud of the entire decade, discussed alongside far larger scandals that would follow it just a few years later. Despite the new management team's genuine efforts throughout 1999 and 2000, Sunbeam could not outrun the weight of what Dunlap's tenure had left behind. The debt taken on for the Coleman, First Alert, and Signature Brands acquisitions never delivered the synergies that had justified their purchase price. Sales continued to underperform even the company's more conservative, honestly reported projections. Creditors who had once been satisfied with the appearance of a thriving turnaround now grew impatient with a company still bleeding money 2 full years after the fraud had been exposed and supposedly corrected. By early 2001, with restructuring options largely exhausted and no buyer willing to take on a company still carrying the reputational scars of one of the decade's most public accounting scandals, Sunbeam's board made the decision that had once seemed unthinkable for a company that had spent a century building itself into an American institution. In February 2001, Sunbeam filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection for a company whose name had sat inside American kitchens since the 1910s, whose mixmaster had been a wedding gift passed between generations, whose coffee master had quietly brewed coffee in countless homes each morning without anyone giving it a second thought. The filing marked something that no advertising campaign or nostalgic appeal to Made in America pride could reverse. This was not the story of a product that had fallen out of fashion or a competitor that had built something better. Sunbeam's appliances still worked. Its brand still carried genuine recognition and, among older customers, genuine affection. What had failed was not the product. What had failed was the trust placed in the people entrusted to run the company that made it. There was no single dramatic final day for Sunbeam in the way some vanished brands experience a locked storefront or an empty shelf that customers can point to and remember. The bankruptcy proceeded through courtrooms and creditor negotiations, rather than a visible public ending. Employees who had already endured years of restructuring, a fraud investigation, and mounting uncertainty now waded through a bankruptcy process that would ultimately take nearly 2 years to resolve. Retailers who had stocked Sunbeam products for decades continued selling them throughout the proceedings, largely because bankruptcy reorganization, unlike liquidation, is designed to keep a company's core operations running while its debts and ownership structure are restructured behind the scenes. What made Sunbeam's collapse different from many corporate bankruptcies of its era was the specific character of what had caused it. This was not a story about foreign competition undercutting American manufacturers, or shifting consumer tastes leaving a once beloved brand behind, or new technology rendering old products obsolete. Sunbeam's appliances had not stopped working. Its customers had not stopped wanting mixmasters and coffee masters and Osterizer blenders. What collapsed was the financial structure built on top of those products by executives who had prioritized the appearance of a turnaround over the substance of one, who had been willing to fabricate the numbers rather than accept the slower, harder work of genuine recovery. For the shareholders who had trusted the company's reported $189 million profit in 1997, only to learn it was worth barely a third of that once honestly calculated, the loss was not simply financial. It was the loss of confidence in the very idea that a public company's reported numbers meant what they claimed to mean. For employees who had endured mass layoffs under the promise that painful cuts today would secure the company's future, the bankruptcy filing confirmed that the sacrifice had been made in service of a fiction rather than a genuine rescue. And for the ordinary American families who had grown up trusting the Sunbeam name without ever thinking much about who ran the company behind it, the collapse offered an uncomfortable lesson about how easily even the most deeply earned brand loyalty could be exploited by people with no lasting stake in what that name had once meant. Sunbeam would eventually emerge from bankruptcy, restructured and renamed, its appliances still manufactured, still sold, still recognizable on store shelves. But the company that emerged in the early 2000s was not, in any meaningful sense, the same institution that Ivar Jepsen and generations of Chicago engineers had spent a century building. Something had been lost in the 2 years of Albert Dunlap's tenure that no restructuring plan could fully restore. The simple, unquestioned trust that had once made a Sunbeam appliance feel less like a purchase and more like an inheritance. Sunbeam emerged from bankruptcy in December 2002, restructured under a new corporate name, American Household Inc. Jerry Levin, who had steered the company through the bankruptcy process, remained at the helm, focused now on stabilizing operations and shedding businesses that no longer fit the company's narrower, more cautious future. The Sunbeam name itself survived, still stamped on mixers, blenders, and irons sold in stores across the country. But the independent, publicly traded corporation that had carried that name since 1897 effectively ceased to exist as its own entity. What followed was a series of ownership changes that would have been unimaginable to the Chicago engineers who built the original Mixmaster. In 2005, Jarden Corporation acquired the company, folding Sunbeam into a much larger portfolio of consumer brands. In 2016, Jarden itself was absorbed into Newell Brands, placing Sunbeam alongside dozens of other household names under a single corporate umbrella. Its identity now one-line item among many, rather than the flagship it had once been. The competitors and category shifts that might, in an ordinary story, have explained Sunbeam's decline were almost beside the point here. Unlike brands undone by changing consumer tastes or superior rivals, Sunbeam's core products, mixers, blenders, irons, coffee makers, remain genuinely useful and broadly trusted throughout this entire period. There was no single competitor that out-innovated Sunbeam or won away its customers through better design. What had actually happened was almost entirely self-inflicted. A company weakened first by a hostile takeover and leadership scandal in the 1980s, then nearly destroyed by manufactured financial results in the 1990s, arrived at the 2000s with a battered balance sheet and a damaged reputation that made outright acquisition, rather than independent survival, the only realistic path forward. There was no meaningful nostalgia relaunch in Sunbeam's case, no limited edition retro campaign designed to win back customers who remembered the brand's golden decades because the products themselves had never actually disappeared from store shelves. Sunbeam branded blenders and irons continued to sell throughout the bankruptcy and every subsequent corporate acquisition that followed. What had vanished was something less visible than a product line: the sense of the company as a distinct American institution with its own history, its own Chicago origins, its own engineers who had spent careers perfecting a single stand mixer. Under Newell Brands' ownership, Sunbeam exists today as one name among a broad portfolio that includes brands like Rubbermaid, Coleman, and Yankee Candle, managed through shared corporate infrastructure rather than the kind of dedicated attention that built its reputation across the 20th century. The broader lesson Sunbeam's collapse offered corporate America arrived just a few years before the country would need it most urgently. Business ethics courses and accounting programs adopted the Sunbeam case as a foundational study in how manufactured earnings could inflate a stock price built on nothing more than accounting technique, how cookie jar reserves and channel stuffing could disguise a business in genuine trouble as one experiencing a miraculous turnaround, and how boards of directors, dazzled by a celebrated executive's reputation, could fail to ask hard enough questions before it was too late. When Enron and WorldCom collapsed into far larger accounting scandals just a year or two later, financial journalists and regulators alike pointed back to Sunbeam as an early warning that had gone insufficiently heeded, a smaller-scale preview of exactly how convincingly a company's true condition could be hidden inside numbers that looked, on paper, entirely legitimate. The economic impact rippled outward from Sunbeam's collapse in ways that extended well beyond the company's own balance sheet. Thousands of employees who had already survived Dunlap's initial restructuring lost their positions in the subsequent bankruptcy and later consolidations. Their years of institutional knowledge about how to properly build a mix master or calibrate an iron's heat settings scattered across an industry that no longer had one dominant employer to absorb that expertise. Suppliers who had built businesses around long-term contracts with Sunbeam faced their own disruptions as the company restructured its operations and renegotiated terms during bankruptcy. Retirees and long-term shareholders, some of whom had held Sunbeam stock for decades as a stable, reliable holding, watched a significant portion of their savings evaporate in a collapse that had nothing to do with the products they trusted for their entire adult lives. What does it mean when a company's products remain genuinely good, genuinely trusted, and yet the institution behind them is still destroyed? Sunbeam's story complicates the simpler narratives told about most vanished American brands, the ones undone by changing tastes or fiercer competition or technology moving faster than a company could adapt. Here, the products survived. The kitchen still had mixers and blenders and irons in them. What didn't survive was something harder to quantify: the specific relationship between a company and the millions of families who had trusted it, generation after generation, to be exactly what it claimed to be. Somewhere in an American kitchen this morning, a Sunbeam Mixmaster from the 1950s is still standing on a counter, its chrome a little dulled, its cord replaced at least once, its motor still turning two interlocking beaters through a bowl of batter exactly the way it did the day it left a Chicago factory. Somewhere else, a grandmother's coffee master sits packed away in an attic, its glass globes intact, waiting for someone to remember how the water rose through the tube on its own and how the whole kitchen filled with the smell of coffee before anyone had lifted a finger. These were never flashy machines. They didn't ask to be noticed. They simply worked morning after morning, year after year, until working reliably became its own quiet kind of magic that an entire generation of American families stopped thinking to appreciate because it had never once let them down. What Sunbeam represented went far beyond the function of any single appliance. For most of the 20th century, it stood for a particular kind of confidence that Americans once placed in the things they bought. That a wedding gift chosen carefully would still be earning its keep 20 years later. That a father's iron would press just as evenly for his son as it had for him. That the machines filling an American kitchen were built by people who expected to still be proud of them decades on. A Sunbeam appliance in the house was rarely just about convenience. It was a small daily vote of confidence in the idea that American manufacturing meant something, that quality was still a promise a company intended to keep long after the sale was final. Families didn't buy a Mixmaster hoping it would last. They bought it assuming it would, because that assumption had never once been wrong. That is what makes Sunbeam's story different from so many other vanished brands. This was never a company that lost its customers' trust because its products stopped being good. The blenders still blended. The irons still pressed a crisp, even line into a shirt collar. What broke wasn't the machinery on the counter. It was something further upstream, in boardrooms and balance sheets far removed from any kitchen, where the people entrusted with 100 years of accumulated trust chose, for a period of just under 2 years, to manufacture the appearance of success rather than do the slower, harder work of earning it honestly. The machines never betrayed anyone. The people running the company did. There is no tidy way to close a story like this one. No single locked storefront or final day that lets a viewer point and say, that is where it ended. Sunbeam's products are still sold today, still recognizable, still doing exactly what they were built to do. But something quieter than a product line disappeared along the way. Something harder to replace than a discontinued model or a shuttered factory. The specific unspoken faith that families once placed in a name stamped onto the base of a mixer, a faith built patiently across a century by engineers in Chicago who cared genuinely about the curve of a handle and the interlock of two beaters, and broken in less time than it takes most people to finish paying off a car. What deserves to be remembered is not the fraud, not the lawsuits, not the executive whose name became a punchline in business schools for a generation of students. What deserves to be remembered is Ivar Jepson, a 24-year-old immigrant with an eye for design, walking into a Chicago factory that made sheep shears and seeing somehow a kitchen appliance instead. What deserves to be remembered is every line worker in Racine and Chicago who understood, without needing to be told, that the object leaving their hands that day would sit in someone's home for the next 20 years, and built it accordingly. What deserves to be remembered is every grandmother who taught a granddaughter to bake standing in front of the same humming mix master her own mother had once used, passing down not just a recipe but a small, steady piece of faith in the things Americans used to build. Somewhere tonight, a family will pull an old Sunbeam mixer down from a cabinet, plug it in, and hear that same familiar hum their grandparents once heard. They may never know the full story behind the name on its base, the fraud, the bankruptcy, the century of ownership changes that followed. They will only know that it still works, and in its own quiet way, that may be the truest thing left of what Sunbeam once was.